So, ladies and gentlemen, we change pace again to Naomi Levin, our next speaker. Naomi is a senior policy analyst at the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council, the premier public affairs organisation for the Australian Jewish community. Naomi focuses on policy matters related to Australia, Israel and the Jewish community, with a special focus on domestic parliamentary and political issues. As a journalist, having worked for a number of publications, including deputy editor of the Australian Jewish News, Naomi's been published widely, including in The Age, ABC Online and the Herald Sun. Naomi's also been called upon by the Commonwealth Government to provide expert input on a range of matters, including terrorism, trade and foreign aid. Recently, Naomi has written about the nature of the coverage of the recent clashes between Israel and Hamas by our public broadcasters, SBC and ABC, culminating in the infamous Q&A program. And this week, I guess, Naomi, I was interested to see that the Jewish News had an opinion piece which covered the results of a poll which said that they'd found that more than 20% of American Jews think that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians. And it lamented that Israel has either lost or doesn't care anymore about the PR war and communicating why they're doing what they're doing. Naomi has researched and written about all these issues, and I look forward to hearing her thoughts on how we deal with the state of the world around us.
Thanks very much, and it's been great to hear the other speakers, so thank you very much for your presentations. I'm going to launch straight in. You've all heard of gay pride. That was a movement that began in the early 70s as a way for people with different sexual identities to show themselves and see themselves in a positive light at a time when bigotry was prevalent. Have you ever thought about a Jewish pride movement? A push by Jewish people to openly identify, to discuss their Judaism publicly, and to defend Israel publicly against the prevailing forces. I want you to hold that thought of Jewish pride because I'm going to circle back to it towards the end of my talk. In my work at the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council, I spend a lot of time researching the portrayal of Jews in Israel on social media. I believe today that much of the anti-Semitism that we see in the community stems from the free flow of hate online. So that's going to be my focus this evening. For the past 18 months, Jews have really been served up a double whammy of anti-Semitism. First, Jews were blamed for the coronavirus pandemic. And then in May, social media users launched a new wave of anti-Semitism as Israel faced a barrage of 4,000 rockets from Hamas. I'll speak first about coronavirus. So in March 2020, a few weeks into the global pandemic, AJAC produced its first report identifying that Jews were being blamed for the coronavirus pandemic and for the spread of coronavirus. Early on, we saw the birth of the hashtag on social media, COVID-1948, a reference to the year of Israel's founding as a modern state. That hashtag was started by Palestinian activists who posted messages like, the virus of 15th of May 1948, Israel is a much bigger threat to humanity than corona. The hashtag was then amplified by the Iranian government and Iranian government sources, including Iran's supreme leader. It was shared 85,000 times in 2 months. It wasn't, unfortunately, just Palestinians and Iranians who were spreading anti-Semitism online at that time. There was a trend of white supremacists and other racial extremists publishing thousands of posts, memes and diatribes suggesting that the spread of COVID-19 and the development of vaccinations was somehow part of a calculated Jewish plot to create a global Jewish government. Unfortunately, we saw this sentiment leak offline as well, and even in Sydney on the weekend at the anti-lockdown rallies, some of these sentiments were expressed on the placards being held at those rallies. So it's very close to home. As we saw in Sydney, COVID-19 related anti-Semitism didn't disappear at the end of 2020, but 2021 brought a whole new wave of anti-Semitism that was equally devastating during the May conflict between Israel and Hamas. So credible analysts believe Hamas had been planning that conflict for months, but possibly even years. But there were certainly online incidents that inflamed tensions and led to that outbreak. One of them was a TikTok video that showed an unprovoked assault by Israeli Arabs against an ultra-Orthodox Jewish man in Jerusalem. In that short video, which I've seen, two Haredim sit on a tram and they're chatting, completely unremarkable. One of the men is approached by another man who, totally out of the blue, slaps his face. I've seen this, and in the most conventional sense of the word, it is shocking, completely shocking. The short video was circulated widely and was in fact part of a dare on TikTok for people to assault Orthodox Jews and film it. So social media videos like this obviously inflamed societal tensions in Israel, and as a result, synagogues were burnt down and Israeli Arabs became the victims of reprisal attacks by extremist Israeli Jews. During the conflict itself, social media platforms were awash with highly emotive videos. The more sensational the content, the more views they attracted. So on the Israeli side, you saw highly distressing videos of Israelis cowering in fear as sirens blared. On the Palestinian side, you saw children crying in front of destroyed buildings and Palestinian terrorists firing barrages of rockets and screaming Allahu Akbar proudly. These videos were spread in a way that wasn't mediated by broadcasters. They just went viral on social media with no context or explanation about what was happening. Let me tell you a bit about the anti-Semitism and disinformation that resulted from the spread of those videos. So firstly, the hashtag Hitler was right trended. Facebook posts called for Jews to be massacred and their bodies ground up. And videos circulated of Islamic clerics accusing all Jews of having hatred and hostility in their hearts. So on Twitter in particular, Israel was repeatedly labelled a colonial terrorist state engaged in ethnic cleansing. This accusation would once have made my jaw drop if I'd seen it on social media, but it became completely unremarkable during the conflict, just given the frequency of when it was made. And unfortunately, these damaging slogans leaked from social media onto placards at posters, at rallies around the world, and then onto the TV news. So they really hit the mainstream. Some of our most knowledgeable commentators increasingly suggest that rising anti-Semitism online leads to real-world incidents of anti-Semitism. So in Melbourne, we saw Free Palestine sprayed outside Jewish schools and Jewish businesses during the conflict. In the United States, Jewish people were bashed and attacked on the streets. And in Britain, you had hoodlums driving around Jewish neighbourhoods shouting about how they wanted to rape Jewish women. So my brief tonight was not to deliver doom and gloom, but to provide some hope. So I'm going to move now into the hope part of my address. To their credit, in the second half of 2020, some of the bigger social media platforms, including Facebook and Instagram, actually started to remove some conspiracy theory and Holocaust denying content, which was great. However, the Iranian Supreme Leader's COVID-1948 posts are still easily discoverable on Instagram. TikTok banned many offensive hashtags that violate the platform's community standards, such as Hitler was right, but others like COVID-1948 remain. And a lot more needs to be done. So Jewish organisations around the world continue to advocate for social media companies to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA's, definition of anti-Semitism in order to better identify anti-Semitism on these social media platforms, and then ultimately to ensure all that anti-Semitic material is removed. In August 2020, so about a year ago, 140 NGOs from around the world, including AJAC, co-wrote a letter to Facebook calling on the social media giant to devise a plan to combat anti-Semitism and adopt the IHRA definition. Regrettably, though, Facebook has not heeded this call. Ironically, Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg was recently bombarded with anti-Semitic messages after he posted a photo of his dog wearing a kippah and a talit. Maybe after seeing the mob come after him over his dog picture, Zuckerberg might reconsider the global call to adopt the IHRA definition on his platform. But if Facebook takes no action, a strong case really emerges for governments to step in. So speaking of governments, there's a group called the Interparliamentary Task Force to Combat Online Anti-Semitism. which is also backing calls for these social media giants to use the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, because as this group has said, without first defining a problem, we can't combat it. So the Interparliamentary Task Force to Combat Online Anti-Semitism is made up of MPs from the US, Canada, UK, Israel, and also includes Josh Burns and Dave Sharma from Australia. And the task force has also called on those social media platforms to be more transparent about how their algorithms work. Now, algorithms are really used to drive us to spend more time on social media. And they do this by showing us more content that they predict will interest us. But there's increasing evidence that these algorithms also drive us to view more extreme content than we would search out ourselves. How algorithms work is particularly topical after the recent conflict, where a lot of pro-Israel content was censored and removed from social media platforms with no explanation. And in fact, Ajax experienced this firsthand with some of our content just deleted off Instagram. While the efforts of NGOs and interparliamentary groups are welcomed, they're unlikely to provide any immediate relief to the problem of anti-Semitism online, to be honest. The cross-border nature of social media companies, the disinclination of these monolithic companies to submit themselves to regulation, and the profitability of extreme speech all leads me to believe that meaningful reform is a really long way off, if it ever happens. So this is where I'm going to circle back to that idea of Jewish pride. There's an emerging group of young people, young Jewish people, reclaiming social media as a space where they can express their Jewishness and their love for Israel. And I want to briefly tell you about some of these people to show you the path that they're taking. I've only met one of them in person. The other two I don't know at all, apart from what they post on social media. But I believe they're charting a course for young Jewish people to fight back against anti-Semitism. So the first one I want to talk about tonight is somebody called Eve Barlow. She's a Scottish music journalist and she's now based in LA. She's edgy and has written about some of the world's biggest music acts. But in recent months, Eve, who is very progressive, has also chosen to be openly, unashamedly Zionist, including posting pro-Israel messages on her very popular social media accounts. She writes things like, "If you want to debate me on my Judaism, I'm going to need you to condemn Hamas first." During the recent conflict, while posting these sorts of messages, she noticed she was losing a lot of social media followers, or being unfollowed, it's called. She hit back at those unfollowing her, accusing them of refusing to educate themselves, and I quote, "People unfollow us knowing we are journalists, advocates, educators. They don't want to engage. They want to stop seeing any other side. The lack of desire to learn is the red flag. I've been offering webinars for over a year. None of those people are ever going to come." And this ties in exactly to what David was saying about people just refusing to go outside their own echo chambers. She added that many of the people who were unfollowing her were social justice warriors, as she called them, but then went on to say they don't give an expletive about Jews. As well as being unfollowed, Barlow received tens of thousands of abusive messages, and I've seen many of them, and they are absolutely foul. She called the treatment she received a social media pogrom and wrote, "The activity that Jews, Zionist Jews in particular, experienced all over the web during the conflict was bizarre at best and invalidating, abusive, and dehumanizing at worst." But rather than backing down, Barlow is doubling down. She continues to defend Israel and express her Zionism and calls on others to do the same, asking Jews who have a platform, rip the Band-Aid off. You have to speak up while you can. The more of us who do, the better. Our voice is tiny. It's an investment in yourself. And I couldn't agree more. So another inspirational young Jewish person is Emily Schrader. And full disclosure, I know Emily and she's been an AJAC. Yes, she's terrific. Emily is American by birth, but made Aliyah after university. The term Hasbara sort of has developed connotations of cliched messages of support, so saccharine support for Israel, regardless of the circumstances. But Emily is revolutionising the idea of Hasbara for 2021 and beyond. She produces short videos responding to current issues and criticisms relating to Israel, and her videos attract hundreds of thousands of views, including on Twitter, particularly on Twitter. Emily's videos make a huge impact, but one recent clip made a particularly big impact. After enduring abuse during the May conflict, including vile, sexually explicit warnings and even death threats, Emily exposed a Malaysian troll army that was behind a large portion of the coordinated attack against pro-Israel social media users like her. This video exposing the Malaysian troll army was viewed over 1.3 million times. After the conflict, Emily wrote of the dangers of being a female pro-Israel voice. She said, "Personally attacking and threatening women is a method of silencing women's voices online and in real life, and deterring new ones from speaking up." She added that while it's draining to be constantly attacked and abused, she has no plans to stop fighting for this worthwhile cause. Finally, to an even younger voice, which is American Blake Flayton. 2 years ago, as a 19-year-old college student, Blake wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times.
Naomi, yes? 14 minutes.
Thank you. I'm nearly done. About the level of anti-Semitism in progressive circles, particularly at universities. He wrote, "Progressive groups attack Jews by comparing them to the very groups that Jews detest most, thanks to our own history. People like Nazis, racial supremacists, and colonialists." Blake, together with a friend, Isaac de Castro, has started an organisation called the New Zionist Congress. And the New Zionist Congress manifesto states that Jewish students are made pariahs, not for what we do, but for who we are. I'm pleased to say that when I spoke to someone heavily involved in the New Zionist Congress last week, I was told it's going from strength to strength. So in a world that seems full of darkness, individuals like Eve and Emily and Blake are pinpricks of light, and they show us that Jewish people don't need to cower due to online anti-Semitism. With the support of politicians, of anti-racist NGOs, and of these leaders, we should all join them in advocating and hitting back and proudly defending Jewish people from anti-Semitism. So tonight, my message of hope is to invite you all to become leaders in an emerging Jewish pride movement. And if you're not sure how to do this, can I just suggest start by following AJAC on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And don't be afraid to share any of AJAC's posts that make you feel proud, make you feel angry, or get you fired up. That way we can all start expressing our Jewish pride. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Naomi, and certainly full of very powerful content, but you're quite right. The courage of young people like those that you mentioned to actually stand up and be there and making their points is really inspiring. I remember sort of reading about the Jewish Pride marches that took place in London and then New York, sort of in the midst of a lot of the attacks that were occurring at the time, and you know, read it in admiration. And we had our own smaller marches here in Australia, but you talk about people with great courage, and that's what we need to look to. So thank you for that.